We're going to look at the topic of God's grace this morning through what Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 1. So I have a little bit of a longer introduction talking about the idea of grace and grace defined. But if you want to turn to 1 Timothy chapter 1, the text this morning is going to be starting at verse 12. Where we're going to look at Paul talking about the grace he received. So, as we try to define God's grace, how would you share that as a Christian when you're witnessing or talking to somebody about God's grace? How would you go out and say, well, I have received God's grace? Well, what does grace mean to you, and what does it mean from a biblical standpoint? So in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word there speaks of deliverance. Deliverance from our enemies, deliverance from affliction, deliverance from adversity. And it also talks about daily guidance and forgiveness and preservation. All of these things are aspects of grace that we would look to in the modern church. All these still fit perfectly. The idea of deliverance. God does provide deliverance. Amen? The main enemy that we are delivered from is Satan himself. Amen? We're told that God, through Christ, has already won the battle over Satan. Satan is conquered, even though he is allowed to operate for a time. And that through God's work on the cross, we take part in that victory. We just sang the song, Victory of Jesus. Amen? Grace speaks to that victory that we have received. Now, when we get to the Old Testament, it is mainly focused on the provision of salvation. The Old Testament view of grace speaks mainly to salvation. So, what is grace? So if we look how theologians would define that, and grace in the New Testament era means God's love in action toward men who merited the opposite of love. So we would use kind of our quick definition as we're receiving something that we don't deserve. Amen? To put it in more layman's terms, we're receiving something that we do not deserve because we have earned the exact opposite. We have earned punishment, yet we receive salvation. God's grace means moving heaven and earth to save sinners who could not lift a finger to save themselves. Now that's important. No matter how much we might try to save ourselves, it is not possible to do that. We can do works, but those works are after salvation and do not earn us one bit of salvation. Those works are a statement of love and devotion to the Father after our salvation. Amen? I know Clint had preached on doing some works and doing the word last Sunday. God's grace means sending his Son to descend into hell on the cross so that we, the guilty ones, might be reconciled to God and received into heaven. The only way for reconciliation spiritually is by the work on the cross. There's nothing else that can be done to reconcile lost mankind to the Father. The gulf can only be crossed by the work on the cross. And there are some very famous illustrations that people have drawn up to help us understand that. You have God standing on one side of a canyon and the sinner on the other side, and the cross is laying flat as a bridge. Have you seen that illustration? It's a good way to look at it. The only way to cross that gulf or that canyon is on the cross that Christ died on. God made himself sin for us. It's an important aspect of grace. God made himself sin for us that we could know his righteousness. And that is from 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Now, I'm going to give you a couple verses. You don't have to turn there because I'm going to give them to you kind of quick. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins in accordance with the riches of God's grace. So God's grace gives us that redemption through his